across the national academies in the United States, the stories that are identified and told about the science that is funded by you and me as taxpayers and serves the world, as the United States, but also the world as the funding to universities that's provided by the science foundations in the United States contributes to graduate education programs. Stanford has many international students, and they are beneficiaries of that as well. So I'm very, very pleased to introduce to you Davis Masten, who is going to talk to us about his perspective on science storytelling and the paradox of suspense.
The presentation I'm going to share with you today was originally given last year at the National Academy of Sciences Sackler Colloquia on the Science of Science Communications. And that's, for those of you who know the National Academy of Sciences, the National Academy of Engineering, the Institute of Medicine, the National Research Council, these are all made up of esteemed members, primarily from academia, but elsewhere. And so the title that we had was Building a Case for Strategic Science Communications, Lessons from Business, ? That it was well received, and I developed this with Peter Zandan. Peter is the global vice chairman of Hill & Knowlton Strategies. Hill & Knowlton is, I think, the second or third largest public relations firm in the world. Peter's best known, I think, as a serial entrepreneur, and developed a company in Austin, Texas called IntelliQuest, which for better than 10 or 15 years was the fastest growing market research firm in the world. That Martha mentioned my relationship with HP, we worked at Microsoft, Apple, but also consumer goods giants like Procter & Gamble and Walmart and PepsiCo. Since selling the company in 2007, I've had the good fortune of having some time on my hands. And with that, while I've done, I sit on some boards and the like, but I've also learned to kayak surf big waves and do triathlons, and most importantly for me, I've become a grandparent. And so that's great, but where I put most of my time is in the radical scale of science and technology. That in that context with the National Academy of Sciences, I'm heavily involved in the quantified self, which is, if you think of the National Academy of Sciences as at the very top of the top down of science, well, the quantified self tends to be more from the bubbling up bottom. And so it's an exciting place to get both perspectives. That I'm starting with this slide, and I'm going to close with this slide. That there are really three observations, and then a framework with three parts that we're suggesting be considered. The observations is, I'll show you in a second in detail, but that science communications is really outshined from a variety of dimensions by corporate communications. That there's change afoot, and I'll give a few examples. And is there a reason for hope? I believe so, and I'm focused on any number of areas specifically around that. From a framework standpoint going forward, that we think there's an increased need for metrics, not that metrics explain everything, but metrics, and particularly around engagement. It's hard enough in science communication circles to get people to be clear about who they're trying to address with their audiences, let alone are people engaged, let alone is there behavior change involved. And in that case, that science communications is way behind business. And so metrics on the experience of engagement is key. And ROI, return on investment, we're not sure that that is the measure that needs to be involved here, but we do think that ROI, or something like it, to really help science communications take off, is necessary, and I'll get into that in a minute. That for those of you who can't read this, the active ingredient is marketing. So it's Energy X as seen on TV, and the scientific community is rightfully skeptical of marketing. For decades, this has been true. It's a little less so than it has been. There's some, but as it happens, Peter, who I mentioned, my co-author here, Peter was in the National Academy of Sciences. They were asked by Congress to look at climate change, rather important subject. 90 of the top climate scientists from all around the United States. Peter was brought in as the communications guy to just advise. Like everyone else, people were volunteering for this experience, and they were going along in the process when it got to the point where it was Peter's turn to stand up and say what he might think, that any number of these esteemed scientists walked out the door in protest, that we don't want to do anything that might have the data be in question, that we might be influenced by the schmucks in communications and in the used car salesmen and marketing. That well, this is something that I think science has reason to have questions, but I don't think it can afford this perspective anymore. Metaphorically, I think of science somewhat like a freight train. It moves tirelessly, doesn't draw a lot of attention to itself. Each car is different, pretty self-contained, but they're connected some. They're not well understood by people who outside that particular car or the train, and not well understood, and they don't really care that they are understood. That the average person, the public, the people who are funding this stuff, a freight train really isn't relevant to their lives, except maybe in a disaster, when something really goes wrong, even though they might think it's important. And I think I'm not suggesting what kind of metaphor it ought to be going forward, but this is an indulgence I don't think we can afford, not if we want the public support. That I'm going to get into some numbers here, but that let me give you one little piece, additional piece of background. That as we all know, DC's in a budget crisis. That the Congressional Budget Office has said that anything on the discretionary side of the budget is vulnerable to being wiped out. Research is on that discretionary side. Now, I don't want to be an alarmist. The AAAS said in August that they expect that the funding for 2015 will stay relatively about the same, up barely, but that it's the taxpayers that are paying for this, and generally, taxpayers think that science and research are important, but they're kind of lukewarm about it. This isn't something that people are calling their congressmen about. They're not hot about the subject. And if you're a freight train, why do you get hot about a freight train? So what we need to do is to change that metaphor, as I said. Now, in terms of other numbers, in 2012, communications spending was over $1 trillion by business. Depending on whose numbers you look at, it's somewhere between $1.2 trillion and $1.6 trillion. So a lot of money. We looked for a single source that would tell us what science communication spending was, and we couldn't find it. let alone competing sources. And that tells you something for starters. By what we could add up, we saw that it was less than $1 billion. Let's say we were off by $1 billion or two. Okay? Proportionally, it doesn't make much difference. We're lost in the sea of other kinds of communications. And as in the science community, we're talking probabilistically. We're not talking about love, romance, and heat. We're speaking much more cautiously. That in that context, that even the market research business had revenues in 2012 of close to $10 billion, 9.7 or something. So business, in trying to understand the effectiveness of what it's doing and how to do it more effectively, is spending maybe 10 times, or maybe this less than $1 billion. If it's 3, they're spending somewhere between 3 to 10 times more in measuring what they're doing than they are than science communicators are spending in general. So it's a little disturbing. And one of the, I think, inobvious things here is that the culture of communications in science doesn't get the positive feedback loops for what's working and what doesn't. So you end up, there's not enough money to draw the best communicators. They're not working in a cycle where they get reinforcement for how to get better, and so it's very tough to engage people when there's so much money and so much expertise and so much talent working elsewhere. The key thing we're trying to do is engage people. And in this context, that these techniques that you see here, almost all of them are ways to measure effectiveness in communications and in business. In that context, that most of them were developed by academics, but they're utilized by business people to a much greater degree. What we're hoping is that with this large sea change in communications that's facilitated by the technologies that are upon us, that we'll be able to invent new techniques that put us at the beginnings of a fresh start for science communicators, and I'd like to talk about that a little bit. And so, but philosophically, I want to hit one little point. Does anybody remember this from the just post President Obama's first election campaign when he won? That the New York Times Magazine had this cover. Did a few people remember this? So in that context, it says, "Is selling a president any different from selling a pizza?" Well, I wonder if selling a science is any different from selling a pizza. Obviously, there are some differences. I'm not trying to say it's the same thing. However, from a technique standpoint and process standpoint, it's not that different. So it's something that these tools are readily available, and there are some inherent advantages that science communicators have that are not enjoyed by business communicators. So just a few things. About 18 million people are enrolled at colleges and universities in the United States, and millions more in K through 12. These people have science. There's an opportunity to communicate with them there, maybe more effectively than what we're doing. The Smithsonian says that there are 850 million visits in 2012 to U.S. museums each year. And that NASA data has 74% of Americans agree that scientists work for the good of humanity. Well, in that context, that's great, but that 74%, when you push on it, is pretty lukewarm. It's not something where people are hitting the streets and trying to defend. Now, as I mentioned, communications is in a sea change facilitated by new technology. We all know about smartphones and how pervasive they are, billions of them, and growing rapidly. Well, you may or may not be aware of each major city now has at least 1 billion sensors in it, and give it X number of years. As I learned at the Trillium Sensor Summit put on by mediaX, that each city will have 10 billion sensors in it. And many of those are ways to tell you that may actually be sensing things in life that may be of relevance to you and maybe on an everyday basis. So in that, and there are groups that are pushing these leading edge areas, that there are things like citizen science, quantified self, things like Apple's health apps and the whole app infrastructure, 23andMe, and I think there are now over 50 million people using apps with counting steps, and it just gives you a sense of that there's movement and action that is moving quickly. So I'm suggesting that we invent the future we want to be in, and that and the new technology can help. Let me give you let me paraphrase a conversation I had with someone that helped me a lot. And this is not somebody I would expect to help me a lot, so let alone to quote in a talk at Stanford. But I found myself talking to Rupert Murdoch, and we were talking about science and science communications. It was fascinating. I'll share one of his points. His point was that science needs to stop talking to people and thinking that they are so important. That to fit into people's everyday lives, you need to find the stories that they're interested in and be part of those stories. So that science sections have gone from this to either non-existent or very thin. And that science hasn't responded by saying, oh, we're not the main story, but we can fit into other people's stories. And so in that context, I think that the opportunities here, particularly for great storytelling and for big data opportunities to understand what's going on, are really quite enormous. A few examples, the Science and Entertainment Exchange is something I've been involved in from the beginning. It's in Hollywood. There are over 800 consultations between Hollywood and the Science and Entertainment Exchange. So if you have a story that is focused on, has something to do with science, they'll provide scientists free of charge. And in those 800 consultations, it's affected stories from The Good Wife to Big Bang Theory, CSI, to movies like Iron Man and the Avengers. And I was talking, one of the people I've gotten to know through it is a guy named Jeff Silver. And Jeff is the producer of, one of the producers of Tron Legacy and the last Terminator movie, but goes all the way back to non-sci-fi things like the Wonder Years on TV. And that on his last 6 projects, he started with the Science and Entertainment Exchange. He's gone to them and has asked to get briefed on the science issues involved. Because he said that with the writers he deals with, that he said that science brings forth much stranger things than the writers would ever dream up. And that then they at least start rooted in the science, in the reality of what's going on, and can take an angle that is fresh and new. So that's an example, and I know that Scott will talk about, well, I assume Scott will talk about this kind of thing in much greater detail. Another example is Lab TV. Lab TV started last year. It's a collaboration between the NIH, TED Med, Jay Walker, who founded TED Med, and Google. And Lab TV goes to postdocs and grad students and really talks about a life of curiosity for people working on NIH projects. And that how you can follow your curiosity in science, unlike you can follow your curiosity in almost any other piece of work or line of work. And it has film students meeting the students, and they work out 3 to 4 minute videos. And then these end up on Lab TV, and then Lab TV gets pushed out to students across America. But that it's these personal stories of science and how that relates from often very humble backgrounds, and unexpected joy comes out of a lot of this, and so it makes it much more relatable. Ralph Cicerone, the president of the National Academy of Sciences, said, "Scientists have great stories to tell, and many important people want to hear them, so let's get going and tell them." Well, Ralph is, I think, in his 8th or 9th year as the NAS president, and science communications has been a priority for him, much as it has for the AAAS. Their CEO, Alan Leshner, is a science communications guy, so it's happening at the top, and movement is going on. But this is a very slow and long process, and science oftentimes utilizes its star communicators. That Neil deGrasse Tyson or Jane Goodall or Brian Greene, or scientists playing scientists on TV like Niam Bialik, that on The Big Bang Theory. There are standouts in that context. But what Peter and I believe is that it will be when people are engaged in science in a way that it's relevant to their everyday lives on an everyday basis, when we'll really start to see the impact. That in this, so I'm going back. Hopefully I've made a case, a brief one, mind you, but a case that we're just being outspent. We're being out-analyzed. There's some change happening at the top. I see reason for hope, but there's a long, long ways to go. And there's with the new technologies, a chance for us to gain a lead by things that the scientific community is inventing. We just need to not just let others use it, but we need to use it ourselves at scale and attract the most talented people in the world. And from a framework standpoint, increasing the metrics that help us make sure that we are in fact engaging people as they live their lives, and that we have some kind of mechanism. We don't care if ROI is it, but it's not a bad place to start. But something that helps make funding of science communications just an everyday part of the scientific process. And because, frankly, I just worry. I worry that there's very little growth in science funding at this point. And this is an administration that's pretty favorable to these issues. There are a lot of movements at foot for very good rationales that may be just deciding to chop billions of dollars that they don't think we have. And so I think the time is right to think about communications as a tool to engage the public, the people who are paying for this, and making science relevant to them in ways we've not considered before. So thank you very much.